don't we go ahead and get started? Thanks for coming. So this is the third in our series of fireside chats. We started this several months ago when it became clear that some of the house staff in particular really didn't know some of the amazing faculty that we have here. My first motivation was to interview Holly Smith when someone asked, "Who is she?" And Holly Smith, of course, is a male and was the chair of this department for about 30 years. So this is our third interview in this series, and I'm thrilled that it's with Andy Josephson, who is a dear friend, probably the best neurologist I've ever seen, one of the best teachers I've ever seen, and is now chair of the Department of Neurology here at UCSF. So Andy, thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. There's no actual fire. But
no fire. There's no fire. Fire, it's a metaphorical fireside chat, yes.
All right, we're good.
So format-wise, we'll chat for 20, 25 minutes and then open it up for other questions or comments. Tell us about your upbringing.
My upbringing. Okay, so I was raised in Indiana, so I'm one of the few Hoosiers around here. There's not a lot of others I know.
I don't hear any hooting from
there
you.
wasn't any. Grew up in Indiana, son of a neurologist. Also son of a speech pathologist, and I had a really nice upbringing. My dad is a neurologist in private practice in the community, and so I think my love of medicine and just taking care of patients came from him. He never pushed me or wanted me to go into medicine, but was delighted when I did so, and then was pretty blown away and excited when it turned out I went into neurology. Not anything I was ever pushed to. My mother's a speech pathologist by training. She ended up working her whole career with Head Start in inner city Indianapolis with a lot of disadvantaged young people, teaching them how to talk. And that to me had a really impressive impression to me. It ended up making me understand around the dinner table, people who are much less fortunate, and I think contributed to a lot of the reasons why I've spent so much time thinking about diversity in my career. And so that was my upbringing. And then when I came out to California for college, I think my parents, it was the scariest thing ever. For a guy from the Midwest flying across the country to get an education, to them was scary. But I really enjoyed being out here.
And do you remember going rounds with your dad and seeing, was there a particular patient or a particular experience that taught you that I actually want to do this for my career?
I don't think so. I mean, I certainly remember my father bringing me to the office and hooking me up with various EEGs and EMG leads for various reasons. The other thing I always tell, there's a lot of med students here who I've encountered. I tell the same stories over and over again. But I remember, as I was a young person growing up, I thought my dad was just the most creative, wonderful dad. He would come home and play all these just amazing games with me. I remember him coming home and he had a suit on, and right when he got home we did all these games. And then it wasn't until I went to medical school that I realized that it was basically a complex neuro exam. He was
doing a mini mental status on you?
No, he was writing numbers on my hand and asking what they were with my eyes closed. We did a lot of finger, nose, finger, and these types of things.
Wow.
Now my kids also have me play these, games with them, and it's sort of a similar story.
So you were, the first thing you drew was a clock with...
That's right, I made all the numbers, right? But no, and I think in all honesty, the reason why I cared so much about his profession, and my mom as well, as two working parents, they both just loved what they do. And I think, folks who know me around here know that there's probably no one who enjoys their job here at UCSF, just thinks it's such a privilege to do what I get a chance to do, than I do. I mean, I just love it. And for me, these were two people who just loved doing what they were doing. And that really made me want to do something along those lines. Both of them in a field where they were helping people. And that was something that was really important to me.
Now, back then in neurology, there wasn't that much you could do for a lot of patients. Did you have any sense of that and any concern as you thought about the field that, obviously you could do a lot of caring for people, but the number of therapies, the scans weren't very good at the time. There's a lot of limitations.
Well, I was lucky. I mean, my father started practicing before there was MRI scans, before had some of the early CT scans during his training, and so I never got a sense of that. I was really lucky that by the time I was an undergrad and by the time I got to medical school, it was really part of this revolution in neurology and neuroscience, with all these incredible treatments and insights into the molecular biology of these disorders. And For me, it was pretty hard to not get excited about the brain, just so much of what makes us who we are, and the fact that we could have patients with neurologic problems and then give them treatments and make them a lot better, meant a lot to me. And in the same time, and I know, we talk about this with folks in your field, whether it be in palliative care, just general internal medicine or hospital medicine, just having connections with patients, and that a lot of treatment we sometimes can do in addition to medicines, in addition to devices that we can help folks, is just being able to care for them and their families in the most sort of vulnerable times when the nervous system is not working well. That very early on was something that really excited me. Having that personal relationship to folks when the sort of chips are down, to me, is what really made me excited.
So you went to Stanford, you went to WashU, you came out here for your residency, and then you did 2 or 3 different fellowships. I was trying to figure it out. So it seems like a pretty eclectic mix of additional training you did on top of general neuro.
Well, it was unusual. I mean, I really wanted, I loved caring for patients in the hospital. I thought stroke was incredibly exciting and sort of neurocritical care. And for me, I had grown up in a laboratory in college studying Alzheimer's disease. And when I volunteered in college, it was with patients who had Alzheimer's disease. And so for me, I was particularly interested in where behavioral neurology meets the inpatient setting. So how do we think about all these terrible cognitive problems that our patients have in the hospital, some of which due to neurologic injury and some like delirium all over the medicine service, really interest me. And I really wanted to get uniquely trained in sort of both areas, sort of think about stroke, think about behavioral neurology. And so I did a few fellowships. I ended up being boarded in vascular neurology and neurocritical care and completing a behavioral neurology fellowship. And for me, it just gave me the training to be able to understand these diseases. I always, I understand, I work obviously very closely with our residents and our fellows, and there's always this tension of how much additional training to get, and at some point it's just, that's too much, probably.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But for me, I just felt like here were 2 areas that I needed to understand in order to inform my research and my clinical work. And so, in the medicine world, I think it's analogous to doing, interventional cardiology and maybe allergy, something that's very, very...
It would make no sense, though. There's no Venn diagram.
I see. Well, maybe we'll get allergic to the dye. I'm not sure. But, the bottom line is I just felt like I had to do both of them. But in neurology, I think you would find a lot of people, despite my story, who would say that makes no sense. Those are 2 very, very different things. They intersect minimally. And for me, I thought that training was helpful. I had great mentors on both sides who let me do all this great stuff.
Well, I was wondering about mentor. We'll talk a little more about mentorship later, but what did mentors say to you when you proposed 2 fellowships that don't have that, or not an obvious Venn diagram, and I'm guessing there wasn't more than a handful of people in the world who had done those 2 fellowships.
Yeah, I'm not sure who else has done. I don't know
or
how
maybe
many
0.
I'm not certain. One of the great things about UCSF neurology, and I think this is the case in many departments at UCSF, but I just know ours so well, is the answer when one proposes something unique, somebody proposes something very different, is, well, let's see how we can make that happen. I don't really see, I remember Steve Hauser, who was chair at the time, said, I don't really see how those 2 come together. I'm not really sure there's that path forward, but geez, Andy, if you think this is a direction that has something exciting at the end, let's figure out how we can support it for a while and make you successful. And that has been one of my biggest mantras, being able to get a chance to mentor young people, is to say, oh, okay, if that's really what you want, let's figure out how we can make it happen. Let's see if it's successful, rather than trying to, it would have been very easy to try to smush me into a box and not allow that kind of different pathway. And our department, I think a lot of the great things we've done, maybe most of the great things we've done, is when people have really done something very, very different. And so we try to support that in any way, because my own personal experience is without that support, I honestly don't think without UCSF neurology, I would have been able to do any of the kinds of things I do. It's just a unique place for training in neurology, and that allowed me to be able to take this very different path.
So did you have a 5 or 10 year plan and say, here's the job that I want, and the way I will get that is this kind of training? Or was it a little bit vaguer than that, and these are the things I'm interested in, I have some sort of sense that it'll work out?
It's a little of both. So I had this 5 or 10 year plan. I remember one of my mentors saying, hey, I want you to write down, where you're going to be in 5 years. I think that can be tremendously useful. And my plan was I was going to do sort of pure 100% sort of delirium research and cognitive deficits after stroke and neurologic entry in the hospital. And I did a lot of that, and that's what I still do, and that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. But somewhere 3-4 years into it, partially because of relationships with you and just seeing how things happened at UCSF, this idea of wanting to take the lead and seeing if we could have inpatient specialists in neurology, to see if we really could have neuro-hospitalists here at UCSF and nationally, and whether that would make any sense, really kind of took me as something very exciting.
So talk about that. So what was it that made you think that, all right, I want to focus a little bit on the organization of care, and then the idea, I'm not sure everybody knows, but Andy was really the pioneer of the hospitalist idea as it got translated into neurology and wrote the first paper about it. And
I, to this day, as folks know, I may do a lot of things, but I'm ultimately someone who just loves caring for patients. And I didn't think our patients were getting great care in the hospital. I mean, it's really that simple. I think that neurologists nationwide and somewhat locally, a lot of folks, we have these we have these wonderful people who were great at caring for patients. And then we had a subset of folks who, were doing it, I think, because they needed to or were told they needed to.
So at the time, to be a neuro attending, you rotated in and maybe you did it 1 month a year.
That's right. And we had great people. We had great legends. But part of the problem that happened, Bob, is that as neurology evolved in a specialty that was had many more treatments and many that were very time dependent. We've got to deliver a treatment for status epilepticus or stroke or increased ICP very, very quickly. You had to have somebody who was readily available, who were there at all times, and was comfortable with all these new treatments that were coming out. Not to mention all we did on the consultative side with the increasingly complex patients in medicine and surgery and you name it, who have these neurologic problems from these new medicines that were coming out in oncology and were coming out in rheumatology. And so for me, I just didn't feel that a lot of the patients I was encountering were getting care from neurologists who really understood and all that was going on in the acute care setting. Our neurointensivist colleagues were kind of sort of coming out at the time with neurocritical care, and I was sort of part of that, but that was very isolated to the intensive care unit. And I saw this whole other subset of patients outside the intensive care unit with complex neurologic issues who I felt sort of needed experts in that area. At least that's what they did part of their time.
Right.
I'm a stroke doctor part of the time, and I'm a neuro-hospitalist part of the time, and I think that's a great model.
So I certainly know the pushback that I got in medicine when we started thinking about this in medicine. What did you get as you started promoting this in neurology?
Well, locally, it was very well received. This was something that people thought was, a really neat idea that we should try out that could be something great academically. And the way we went about it is we never said to folks, hey, you really shouldn't attend anymore. What we did is we said, okay, to be an attending, to run our service, here are the 9-10 things everyone's got to do. You've got to be at multidisciplinary rounds. You've got to be comfortable caring for patients with this, that, and the other disorder. We can go on and on. And what happened was that a lot of our attendings said, great, I'm happy to do that. That would be wonderful. And that worked out fine. And some attendings said, well, it's not quite right for me anymore. I'm fine not doing so. I mean, at the time when we started more than a decade ago, I was the only neurohospitalist. So it meant I was on service for 10 months a year at the time. And that was a tremendous learning experience. And then, we've subsequently, I loved it.
I know you did. I saw it.
You remember?
I watched, yes.
And we have a fellowship. We now have a very big division within our group. And so, for me, and then it expanded into how can we make this model work nationally and thinking about national quality metrics in inpatient neurology. And then it bled into outpatient quality metrics. And so, a lot of things in neurology were a little bit behind internal medicine and other specialties, but I think we're sort of catching up, putting the patient at the center and figuring out how we best can care for them.
So you're known for a lot of things, but maybe your teaching might be the first among them, and you've won every teaching award I think we have. I remember seeing you give a talk, maybe for the first time in M&M, probably when you were a resident, and I said, this guy's very special and has some innate ability to teach. So first of all, tell us where that came from and tell us a little bit about your philosophy of teaching. What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, I mean, where it came from, I'm not certain. I mean, I think in both undergrad and in medical school, I sort of took advantage of opportunities to teach. I love it. I mean, I think there is nothing more rewarding than teaching someone, in my world, neurology. I mean, I find that very fun. A lot of the house staff in the audience suffered through our medical student course, and so had to deal with me for 10 weeks back then. It's just such a privilege to teach people of all levels that I just find it incredibly enjoyable. So where it came from was, again, it was just something that I did, I found enjoyable, I wanted to pursue it. You may be getting this sense that Andy didn't plan a lot of this out. It just ended up being experiences in my life that I really enjoyed, that I really felt were worthwhile, I've tried to cultivate and get better at. And my
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
my philosophy of teaching is to just try really hard to make sure I'm at the learner's level and understand the learner. As you've seen, I teach very differently when I'm teaching in medicine M&M, than I'm teaching in brain movement and behavior, than I'm teaching in one of your CME courses, or when I'm teaching to neurologists. And I think so much of it is sort of understanding the learner and understanding that teaching can always get better. I feel like I'm a better teacher this year than I was last year, and it's because last year I spent a lot of time in a self-critical way saying, what could I have done better? Whether it was those 5 minutes on rounds or a talk that I gave in front of a few hundred people. I just think it's one of these skills that you're not born with. You just get better and better the more you practice and think about it, and that's what I spend a lot of time doing when it comes to teaching.
You talk about, do you have 2 or 3 pearls that when you see someone who you don't think is all that effective a teacher, you would say, here are if they could do these 3 things, they'd be much better?
Well, I mean, the first was the thing I just said, which is you've just got to know your learners. I mean, when subspecialists get in front of medicine docs, for instance, seasoned medicine physicians at one of your CME courses, for instance, Bob, and they just don't understand what they know about gastroenterology or neurology or hematology, it's the death knell. I think that's number 1. Number 2 is, as you know, I try to infuse a lot of humor when I teach, and I think that we are talking, especially in neurology, about such heavy subjects. I mean, these are people with nervous system injury who often have life-threatening diseases, or certainly diseases that will leave them potentially not like they were before.
Why not make that funny?
It's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. And if you go for 45 minutes on that without injecting any humor or a breathing point or something that ties it into their daily, that's real trouble. So I mean, those are probably the 2 things I always live by. And then the third is just, it's a heck of a lot of work. When I give a lecture, but one example, and the group will laugh. One of the lectures I'm sort of known for giving is I give the brainstem lecture to the first-year medical students.
I see some of them shaking their heads. Yeah.
Have dealt with this
All
before.
Right.
I've given a similar lecture for the last, 10 years or so. Every year, I give that talk 2 or 3 times in my bedroom leading up to the talk. I practice it again, the timing of it, the slides, etc. And I guess my third point is teaching is hard work.
Yeah.
You really have to prepare and practice it. Maybe some people do, but I don't have the innate ability to be able to just do a talk and hope it goes well. I practice very hard, all aspects of the talk beforehand.
This is incredibly important because if you've heard Andy speak, it feels effortless. It often feels like, wow, he was born knowing how to do that. And so knowing how much work it takes is really actually quite helpful. I saw one of the teaching awards you won is the Golden Toe Award.
Oh, everyone loves the Golden Toe.
Do you have a Golden Toe? What does that mean?
So the Golden Toe Award is the award that we award as our residents each year name one teacher sort of the Teacher of the Year. You can only win it once. It's named after Bob Laser, one of our sort of legendary physicians who's still in our department of neuromuscular specialists. And the award itself is a golden foot with an extensor plantar response.
I see.
We're pretty nerdy in the neurology world. And it turns out that the foot, this award was started when Dan Lowenstein, now our provost, was a resident. And the foot is a mold that Dan made of his then, 2-year-old son. It was even less than that, maybe a year-old son's foot.
Wow.
So there is actually a foot. It gets passed from person to person.
So you don't have the golden toe at your house?
Unfortunately, no, I don't. It gets passed on every
the
year,
green
and we tell
jacket,
people,
yeah.
if you break this thing, you're in huge trouble. So please don't break
With
the
Dan.
toe.
That's fascinating. You gave the commencement address for the med students here. What'd you choose to talk about?
Well, this is another sort of knowing your audience. I gave a talk. It was many, many years ago now, or a few years ago now, and I really focused on what it was like being a new doctor. I have such memories. I mean, I remember every moment of July 1st of my intern year in this department in medicine. I remember the patients I saw. I remember what I did that day, and I remember how much I screwed up, which was a heck of a lot. And that's one of the messages I gave during that commencement address, was just what it was like to be a new doctor, how exciting it was, but that, we all are going to mess up a lot. And making sure that you expect that, don't get down about that, figuring out how you have your own identity as a physician was something I spent a lot of time talking about. That was a tremendous honor that the class allowed me to give that speech. I know you've given a number of commencement speeches yourself, Bob, but it was one of the highest honors I've ever gotten. And there's a speech. If I could tell you the number of times I practiced that one, I was really apprehensive about giving that.
Scary.
Yeah.
You've been head of the ethics committee for a long time. How did you get into that?
Well, again, it's sort of this idea of things I really found interesting. In neurology, we have an opportunity to interact with lots of patients in the hospital who have difficult things going on, and that includes neuroethics and ethics in general. And then there's this whole other subset of patients in the hospital who never see a neurologist, have nothing neurologic going on, but have these ethical conundrums. How do we best care for patients? How do we deal with conflicts between many, many different tensions? And sometimes it's the patients or their families and the physicians in conflict. Sometimes it's the physicians and other members of the staff in conflict. And sometimes it's the physician and the patient and the system in conflict. And I was given an opportunity when I was a junior attending to participate in a couple of these ethics consults. And I just found it, about as fun as something could be. Tremendous weighty issues, difficult issues, no good answers. But I felt that I enjoyed and kind of had a knack for helping folks talk through these types of issues. And so for the last, it's been about 10 years, I've chaired our ethics committee that does consultations throughout the hospital on patients who have difficult ethical dilemmas, and I've had an opportunity to mentor a number of people in that role. And I think we are a service that gets involved, and when we're able to get involved in a case, it really ends up being something very intellectually stimulating.
Did you need additional training for that?
I did. So I didn't do a formal, ethics curriculum, if you will, or get a master's in ethics, but I spent a lot of time in a variety of settings, sort of learning more ethics, learning more neuroethics. And for me, it's again one of these things, I feel like I can get better every year on it. I'll do an ethics consult and I'll walk away and I'll say, yeah, but that 5 minutes when we were talking about that, I didn't really conceptualize that well. I didn't explain that well to the group. And so it's just a matter of trying to get better year by year.
The field you chose, neurology, is changing drastically in terms of better understanding of the way the brain works, and then the clinical trials portion of it. It seems like every week there's a blockbuster. So talk about the evolution of the field that you've seen in your lifetime in it, and how that's changed your leadership role.
Well, I mean, I think, ultimately our department, which, we really think about all of our missions as a whole, we're a big research department. We have a tremendous amount of basic science research in neuroscience. We have a tremendous amount of clinical research in neuroscience, and something that we all are invested in, because we think that the types of research that we really focus on are those areas of research that are going to lead to breakthroughs that help patients. And as you say, I mean, the pace of discovery in neuroscience has just been amazing to behold. I think the other piece that's been exciting is how neuroscience interacts with other specialties. Some of our biggest breakthroughs, for instance, our big multiple sclerosis breakthrough, has to do with really understanding neurology and immunology. Mm-hmm. And neurodegenerative disease really has gotten into neuropathology so much, and how programmed cell death occurs, et cetera. We could go on and on with these examples. I think one of the things we've learned in neurology, and this is really important to how we run our department, is that we cannot be insulated. That so much of what we do depends on specialists, researchers from multiple different areas. This Weil Institute for Neurosciences that we announced due to a generous gift of Joan and Sandy Weil just a year ago, ultimately is really bringing together the fields of neurology and psychiatry, which I think is just silly that they're two different fields. These are two different fields that deal with problems of the brain. And schizophrenia is a neurodegenerative disease. A lot of what we study are behavioral diseases, and so it's very artificial. And so I think what you're seeing in neurology...
You're talking to an internist who thinks neurology, the brain is just another organ and could have easily lived in our department.
That's right. That's right. But remember, all these organs are sort of supporting this organ.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I mean, I think what this pace of discovery and our just push to get better at getting bed to bedside occurring quickly, what it's led to is a real feeling that when we're talking about disease of the nervous system, this is a collaborative effort that goes far beyond neurology and even far beyond pure neuroscience. And so we've tried, in my leadership role, we've really tried to design ways in which our investigators can easily interact with other investigators, not only across the campus, but across the globe, to make these discoveries. And that, for me, has been incredibly rewarding. My life in neuroscience began in a basic science neuroscience lab, but I don't live in that world now. I'm not a basic neuroscientist. That's not where I've chosen to spend much of my time. And we've got incredibly talented people. So being able to support them and to really push forward our research mission, which is one of the key things I work on a daily basis, has been exciting. And these collaborations have, I think, really allowed us to do things in creative pieces that other places haven't been able to.
Talk a little bit about time management, because you've told us you're chairing a huge department. You still do research, you still see a fair number of patients, you teach a lot, you run the ethics committee still. How does that all work?
Well, I mean, I think I'm busy. I think we're all busy. It helps I don't sleep that much. That has been helpful.
How much do you sleep?
Not a lot. Not a lot.
3, 4, 5?
Somewhere along those lines. I'm one of these weird, Louis Potasek in our department really has defined some people with sleep differences where they have shorter sleep or they wake up a little bit earlier, and I tend to wake up pretty early, things along those lines. But the bottom line is, stop that. Let's
sounds like that's as far as you want to go
my
there,
pathology. But I think when it comes to time management, I think I'm very careful. I'm protective of time for each of these endeavors, and I'm protective of time with myself and my family. And I think it's important that we understand that we're generally better physicians, better at what we do if we're taking time for ourselves outside of our professional roles. And so I'm very careful how I plan the week. And I tend to say during this period of time I'm focusing on X, and then this period of time I'm focusing on Y. One of the things that for me is just so exciting about being in academics is that my life actually changes from month to month. So just yesterday we had the final exam in our first year neuroscience course that I direct, the brain movement and behavior course. And so for the last 7 weeks, all I've really done is teach the first year medical students. I mean, that's been, I'm not on service. My research kind of gets a little quieter, and that's what I've done. And now, just about the time where I thought, that's been a lot, time to do something else, it ends, and I can focus elsewhere. So that sort of sinusoidal piece to my life, whether it's being on service, whether it's thinking about education, that's really very fun. And it allows me, I think, in time management to sort of compartmentalize things. And then above all this is sort of my role as chair and mentoring young people, whether it's working really closely with each and every one of our residents or some of the students. That sort of is always there, and that just makes you think it's all worth it. I mean, that's kind of been my way forward.
So talk a little about mentorship and the best advice you got and the advice that you like to give to people.
Well, I mean, I think I've gotten a lot of great, I'm lucky, I've gotten a lot of great advice. I think some of the themes we've talked about before, do what you like. Don't let somebody tell you, well, that's impossible because it's a new or different idea, and try to chase it. I think that's important. And then just sort of work incredibly hard. Those are sort of the key areas of mentorship that I've gotten a lot of great advice. I've gotten a lot of bad advice.
So what are examples of bad advice you got?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of them had to do with the opposites of things we've said. That, oh, well, this is a more traditional path. It would be much safer. You should really do that. Or don't. I always tell people I'm mentoring, don't take on too many things. And I think that is good advice. But I think the corollary is that if there's a few different things you like to do, try to do them all, but you got to do them well.
Yeah.
And if you get to the point where you feel like, I can't do all these things well that I'm being asked to do, then you have too many things.
Mm-hmm.
I really work with all the residents in our department and the junior faculty when I meet with them. It's just sort of how to say no. I think around here that's really tricky. You have to be protective of the things that are meaningful to you. And I also think to some extent, advice I always got that was good was that you got to realize after a while what you're good at and what you're not as good at. Mm-hmm. And if teaching is something you're talented at, then by all means, not only pursue it, but get really, really good at it. And you could say the same thing about all the various aspects that we've touched on or that all of us do on a daily basis.
And what is the answer to how to say no?
So I think the answer on how to say no is, one, be prepared to do so. And then number two is to have somebody who's more senior to you, who's your division chief, who's your department chair, who's whatever, who says to you up front, feel free to invoke my name. I say that all the time to people. Mm-hmm. You know, feel free to say no to something if you don't think it's a good opportunity. I'm happy to talk about it with you, and you can feel free to blame me for that. Say, well, Andy, you know, I'd love to do this, but Andy really says I need to focus on X, Y, or Z. I think we as sort of mentors around here need to provide the cover and the protection for our younger folks to be able to say no to things when it's, you know, perhaps not the best for their career.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the direction that UCSF is going in? I mean, you're now in a large leadership role. You're seeing the strategic direction, and it's getting bigger, and the research is getting more complicated, and all that. How do you think we've positioned ourselves?
Well, I think it's very exciting. I mean, we're in such an unusual position where we are able to grow our research mission at the same time we're growing our clinical mission while remaining excellent in education and doing creative things and really pushing our missions of diversity and global health and public health. And it's just such a unique place to be. That being said, I think, you know, our biggest tensions as a department involve the fact that we're spread out across multiple sites. And I've talked a lot about how we try really hard to build community within our department. You could say the same thing about the school at large or the campus at large, but we're challenged that we're all spread out. We all are now become huge. When I joined our neurology department, our number of faculty, I can't tell you the exact number, but we probably had 50, 60, 70 faculty. We almost have about 200 faculty now. Mm-hmm. And when you get to 200 faculty, it's nothing like the Department of Medicine, but when you get to 200 faculty, you know, figuring out when we should all come together around which types of topics and which things doesn't make sense for us all to be in the same room or all to be connected electronically, I think that's really tricky. Mm-hmm. I am very acutely aware of what I view as a concern around continuing to keep our community together. And so we just did this big strategic planning initiative, and one of our pillars that we looked at was community. Mm-hmm. Because we wanted as a department to figure out how we can make sure that people still felt part of the department, were able to tap into those exciting collaborations, would all be able to interact with our residents and fellows who are sort of put on this incredible pedestal in our department as the people we're all trying to encourage and have a chance to work with. And I think that's the tension. We've mm-hmm. just gotten large, like any other organization, and we've got to figure out how we can still be together and work towards some common goals, even though we may all be very different.
The other tension I experience, and I think you probably do too, is as each of these areas gets bigger and more complicated, it's hard to be a triple threat. The researchers are tending to focus more on the research. The clinical world is getting busier and the productivity pressures are greater. How are you balancing those?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think to some extent that's correct. At the same time, the other tension is when our folks who do translational research have a chance to not only see patients, but to be able to interact with our residents and students and teach them not only about the patient, but about how their research is relevant. That's when, you know, the light bulbs all go off and, you know, stars fall from the ceiling. So, you know, being able to figure out ways in which our communities can still interact despite the fact how complicated it is, having our clinicians who are on service, who are pure clinicians, on the inpatient or outpatient side, really understand what we're doing in the research space as a department, and understanding cutting edge research and be able to give ideas to our researchers so we could do, bedside to bench, and then vice versa, be able to get those treatments to folks. I think that's the magic that we try to create. So there's a tension between both that I don't think there's good answers, but we spend a heck of a lot of time trying to think about it.
Is there an Alzheimer's breakthrough coming soon?
I sure hope so. I think that we have gotten to the point in Alzheimer's where, I know this is being recorded, but we're 48 hours since Bill Gates announced a huge gift to try to make progress in Alzheimer's disease. And I think our department, and more importantly our campus in general, is I think uniquely positioned to be part of those breakthroughs. I think there's a lot right on the launch pad in the next few years. It's hard to imagine another disease that is so desperate for effective treatments and that will affect so many of us and our loved ones that I spend a lot of time worrying about how we're going to make sure that we're attacking this disease in every way possible as a department. And so much of this is collaborative nationally and internationally. I think we're close, and there's a lot of directions currently being explored, but when we get to that point, that's going to be something that really changes the lives of millions of Americans, obviously.
And we're here in Silicon Valley, and what you pay attention to is a version of a computer, I guess, or a computer is a version of that. How does the technological revolution impact the field of neurology going forward?
Well, I think tremendously. I mean, I think whether we're talking about decision making and sort of artificial intelligence type pieces, when we're thinking of big data sets, when it comes to thinking about our clinical research, again, behind, I think, internal medicine in terms of what we've done, or whether when we think about how technology is really what advances much of what we do in the laboratory, I think that's important. There's very few, in my mind, discoveries in neuroscience that haven't really started with some technological breakthrough. Mm-hmm. Whether it's thinking about a tool that you can use in the lab, or something that really allowed us to reconceptualize how we could quickly move data through the laboratory, so much of it. And so we have spent a lot of time cultivating these partnerships. We're really lucky where we are in Silicon Valley. It's helped us with intellectual development, and it's helped us with philanthropic development in terms of thinking about how we can interact with various companies. We are really fortunate, and I can't imagine that the next breakthrough, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's, whether we're talking about another disorder, isn't going to hinge on that kind of partnerships with industry and technological breakthroughs.
So maybe my last question, you seem to have a huge amount of fun in everything you do. Do you ever have a bad day?
I have all sorts of bad days. I think that's and if we keep going here, this will potentially turn into one with these personal questions, Bob. But yeah, I mean, I think everybody has good days and bad days, but I sort of wake up every morning and honestly pinch myself that I'm able to do all this. I mean, UCSF has been so kind that I get to do all the things, some of the things we've talked about here. And you're not going to find anyone who likes their job better. And so when you're having one of those bad days, you take a moment, you see a patient, you talk to a junior colleague or a resident and hear what they're doing, and it really sort of fills you up with a tremendous amount of joy. I'm just, every day really excited that I get a chance to do this.
Well, we are lucky to have you. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left. I'll throw it open and see if folks have any questions or comments.
Thanks for being here, first of all, and sharing all this. I think it's helpful for us to see somebody role modeling so many of the great things we hear about. One thing that you talked about that I'm curious to learn more about is you have the education, patient care, research, and administrative tasks on your plate, and you talked about personal time management a little bit. But one thing I'm curious to hear your perspective on is in terms of financial reimbursement, some of those are more or given more, money to do than education in particular. And I know that's institution dependent, but with that in mind, how have you found time to carve out and prioritize education? And do you have any advice on negotiating positions to make sure, if we're interested in education, that that's part of our portfolio.
Just be careful, he's probably going to be negotiating
Yeah, I
with
was
me for
gonna
a
say.
job in a couple of years, so this may come back.
That's
Go
right.
ahead.
No, first of all, it's a great question. Thanks. I remain concerned, and we have been concerned for many years, especially as we've sort of developed the health system here, that you wonder if education becomes sort of the forgotten leader, in that we know how we pay for research, we know how we pay for clinical work, but how do we pay for those great educators? And I think the school's done a very wonderful job in investing in leaders in education, people who run a clerkship, people who run a course, et cetera. That's been just something that UCSF does that I think very few other places do. But I think we need to take it a step further and think about how we invest in educators who spend maybe only some of their time. They're spending a clinic a week or 2 clinics a week with a resident or with a medical student. Our department's really been a pioneer in this world, in that we have come up with a plan, and this is going to launch probably in the next 12 months or so, where we're going to invest in sort of a way to, and Bob knows this, we invest in a way to reward those frontline educators for their education work. Because I think the problem we can get into is a situation where someone says, I'd love to have that resident in my clinic, but it would be much faster, I would be able to generate more income if I could just do it myself, because I'm not going to make any money from that piece. We are hoping to be an example for other neurology departments and other departments sort of throughout the school, because this is something that we think we've got a good plan for, and we're just starting this year in a sort of data gathering stage, and we've put aside actually a fair amount of money as a department to invest in this. I think it's crucial, because if you think about what is the one thing that an academic medical center does that's unique, it's education. There's other places that do research, there's other places that give clinical care, and it's one of the best things about UCSF, whether it's our residency, your residency, or medical students, or you could go on, or our postdoctoral fellows. This is the key of what makes this place great, and if we're not able to invest in it, if we're not able to reward it like we do all of our other pieces of the mission, then we're going to be in real trouble. So I view this as something we need to do. And as far as negotiating, I hope you're going to be in a position when you're ready to have that conversation where a lot of this is worked out, where educational activities are more rewarded on a broader scale, not just for those individuals, as UCSF has always done, who play large leadership roles, but people on the front lines.
Take that a step further. It's possible he'll be negotiating with a place that has not figured out the intricacies of what Andy's talking about is something called educational RVUs, basically trying to come up with a value of an educational encounter the way we have a value for a clinical encounter. So let's say he's negotiating in a place that has not done that, because 99.8% of places will not have done that. Any tips on getting sort of the right job if part of what you want to do is be an educator?
Well, I think that most places have a set expectation for everyone on the faculty. That's the baseline amount of teaching that you need to do as a faculty member, and that's part of the game. I mean, that's part of what you're signing on for. If you're going to be a professor at place X, this is the amount of teaching that's required. And I think that's just part of it, and that's probably not going to be rewarded. But if you're someone who wants to do something beyond that, I don't want to just do the baseline amount of teaching, I want to do X, Y, or Z, then I think that's an expectation that you set down at the beginning. You say, this is what I like, and that's going to take X% of my time, and then work out how that's paid for. And there's lots of different ways that can be paid for. This is very, very tricky business. I always tell people when they're negotiating for jobs, and this works out often not great for me personally, is go ahead and just say what you want to do. Like write down. There's tremendous advantage to writing down that, as Bob talked about, where you want to be in 5 years. And when you're thinking about a job, what would my ideal job look like? This is what I would do on a daily basis. This is how I would break down my time. Present that and say, okay, together can we think about how close we can get to this and how we would pay for this? Because I just, again, my philosophy is letting people do the kinds of things that they find fulfilling. And if you do that, that's going to be a faculty member who's really successful, as opposed to someone who we try to put into a cubbyhole that they're not really interested in being in.
When someone negotiates with you, are you put off when they have been a little bit forward and said, here's what I want to do, and it's ambitious, and I'm going to be asking you for some resources, or is that something you find attractive?
That's what I find great.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the kind of, as you can imagine, I'm a pretty straightforward guy to negotiate with. I want to know what you need to be successful, and then we need to figure out whether we can make that happen and how we can make that happen. And maybe my job is to go out and raise some money to make it happen, but we invest in people. I mean, so much of my job has been, and what I love about UCSF is I'm very much a people person. I love getting to know all sorts of people, and if we've got the right person and they've got a great idea for how they're going to launch a career, whether it be in any of our missions, from pure clinician to pure researcher to pure educator to somewhere in between, then we should be able to figure out a way to keep that person around and support them in their mission. And that's how we've, I think, been so fortunate to have such great faculty and young people in neurology.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, all the way in the back. Saj. Let's get a mic to you and also then say who you are.
Hey, I'm Sajjan Patel. I'm one of the hospitalists. Nice to see you, Andy. Thanks for the talk. This has been really enlightening. My question for you is, given how prolific your career has been, the number of titles you hold, and how much time you spend in the hospital, how do you find time for your personal life or make time for it in practicing self-compassion? How would you suggest that we role model that for our trainees?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think, number one, one has to understand its importance. One cannot have the idea that personal life is something that I do when work gets quiet. One has to, no matter where you are in your career, make this a priority, because I firmly believe, and we say this to our faculty all the time, that if you don't do that, the work will suffer. You won't enjoy it, you won't do as good of a job, etc. So I'm very careful about carving out those times in my day, in my week, in my month that are really for personal time, and I'm quite protective of them. And folks know this is a time where Andy's off the clock to some extent, even though everybody knows my cell phone pretty much in the whole hospital and calls me at any hour if there's a question. I'm happy to do that. But I think one really has to carve out those times, because if one does not, that's where I see, we talk a lot about burnout. In the world of neurology nationally, I think it's less of a problem here, but nationally, neurologists are in the top 25% when you talk about specialties with burnout. We're pretty darn high for a variety of reasons. And I think a lot of that, not all of that, but a lot of that is a feeling of you're not in control of your schedule and that you don't have carved out your own personal time. So I would say no matter who you are, no matter what level of training you're at, being very clear about what time is your own, what time is away, and understanding that it is not just, so I can have fun. It's because if you don't do that, the professional life will suffer. No one is going to be a better physician, a better doctor, a better academic neurologist or whatever by working more and giving up that personal time. It's just that essential.
Andy, great talk. Thank you. Steve Ludwin, hospital medicine. Andy, you've alluded to this in your talk, and certainly the people at UCSF, top to bottom are incredible. It's just an incredible group of people. In your experience, both students and house staff and junior faculty, the ones that really kind of blew you away, that were incredibly exceptional, was there any shared characteristics amongst that group? And if there are that come to mind, if you don't mind sharing with us.
Well, that's a great question. That's one I'd love to have Steve an hour to think about. But I would say off the top of my head in 10 seconds, I think that generally they are people who just love being here and love what they do. And whether, again, across whatever it is you like to do, these are people who every day are enjoying it. It's usually people with good humor and people who are just really kind of happy to be around. I think that is a common one. Work hard. I think everybody here works really hard. So they're hard workers, but they're people who really, really enjoy their job. The final thing I'd say is that so much of it is vision. It's knowing what it is you want to do ultimately. And as a student, as somebody just starting out as a faculty, you may not know, but at least you're thinking about that. You're having some introspection into, well, geez, I did that for the last month. I don't like that very much. Or that's something I really did like. So I don't think that people at whatever level need to all know exactly where they're going to be 20 years from now. But I think one should give it a shot. And then most of the great people revise that shot every few months and say, well, wait a second, no, actually I like that better. And those are the people I've seen be really successful. But the final thing, as you know, Steve, is that I've just been impressed, and maybe this is a UCSF thing, at the diversity of people, personalities who are successful around here. That there's much more not in common in our successful people than is in common. And I think that's a testament to the university. I think that's a testament to San Francisco and where we live in the Bay Area. And I think that means we're doing something right in that regard.
So since you now have to spend a fair amount of your time interviewing candidates for various jobs, leadership positions, do you have a favorite question, the question that helps you discriminate who's going to be successful?
I don't. I'm just getting ready. Next week we will start residency interviews. I've interviewed every resident applying to this program for the last decade or so, and I have never asked the same question to everyone. I don't do that.
You don't have a formal list.
I just have a conversation. So I don't have that gotcha question or how many. I remember in college there was this, there was a consulting firm who their question was always, how many pennies are at Stanford Mall right now? And you had to think about, well, there's ashtrays in the parking lot or whatever, and it was some measure of I guess, how well you thought of things. I don't have anything along those lines. I basically just ask people what they like to do and have a nice conversation with them. And I feel like within 10, 15 minutes of talking to someone, I can get a good sense of who they are. I guess it's just my innate sort of love of getting to know a bunch of different people. I view it very much as a conversation.
Well, I think that's part of what you're looking for, it sounds like, which is someone not only with passion, but someone who wants to keep learning. And
I think that's right.
I mean, your entire career has been, you've gone in directions that I really am interested in this, and I'm going to learn about that. And that's an innate skill that you have, I think.
Yeah, I think the keep learning piece, that lifelong learning piece, no matter where you are in medicine, is something I've always really held on to. I feel like I just can always get better, and it's something I really strive to do throughout.
Great. Well, we're out of time. Andy, this was terrific. Thank you for taking the time to do it. Really
Thanks a lot,
appreciate
Bob. Thanks, everyone.